Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. I've got Tony Jordan, President of the Parking Reform Network, here with me, and we're going to make a habit of having at least someone from Parking Reform Network to help me introduce each episode of Reinventing Parking, as we did last time, because Reinventing Parking, as you would have heard if you're a regular listener, is now the official podcast of the Parking Reform Network. Hi, Tony.
Hello, Paul.
This episode this time is from Brazil. Have you been to Brazil?
No, I have not.
Me neither. But it was really fascinating talking to three people in Brazil about parking reform in São Paulo. You had a listen. Did you have any immediate reactions?
Yeah, first, I think it's so interesting to hear these interviews you do and get in-depth look at how other cities are doing things.
The Parking Reform Network and also Reinventing Parking, we do have international aspirations, and we're hoping to reach out to people all over the world and invite them to become members. So that's part of the reason to be so international in our episodes.
It was great. As listeners will hear later in the interview, they've collected some great, I think, data on how eliminating parking mandates impacts the ability to build social housing and build housing near transit.
Yeah, that was really impressive. And that echoed the buzz from the US, and I was very happy to hear that.
Yeah, no, it's always great to see the confirmation of things. And then I especially liked hearing that they have impact fees or that they have an interesting way of dealing with discouraging parking that's not a hard parking maximum, but is more like a graduated impact fee and almost kind of development penalty for building too much parking in areas where they don't want many cars.
Yes, that's right. And I was struck by the fact that part of the development industry was opposed to some of these reforms. There was almost no pushback about abolishing the mandates, abolishing the minimums. What they pushed back against was this abolishing their free FAR and making them pay a fee for building excessive parking. That was controversial. So,
right. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned. I know in Austin, in Texas, similarly, the parking doesn't count toward FAR. And so there's huge parking podiums. Sometimes half or more of the building are made up of parking.
And the on-street scene had some very exciting and positive stuff, and also a cautionary tale. They have digital only for payments on, and that was kind of striking because that's something cities hesitate with. But basically, you can go to a corner store if your mobile phone is dead or if you don't have a phone. But one mistake they've made, and the three speakers were upset that the city has decided to have a long-term contract with just one parking payments vendor, and they considered that to be a terrible mistake. And so, yeah, it's not all good news from São Paulo, sadly.
Right. It was a 20-year concession, although still better than Chicago with their
Yes.
70 years left or whatever is on that contract. No, that was. I thought that their on-street was great, and I really did like that. I'm glad you brought up that example of having an alternative like the newsstand or something for the very few people who probably own a car and not a phone at the same time.
So it's nice talking to you, Tony. That's probably enough. We'd better get into the episode.
Yeah, great.
Listeners here from São Paulo.
Enjoy.
Welcome again to Reinventing Parking. I'm Paul Barter. This time I'm joined by three amazing people in Brazil to help us understand parking and parking reforms in Brazil's mega city, São Paulo. In Rio de Janeiro, we have Clarisse Linke, who is Country Director at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, Brazil. In São Paulo, we have Hanna Machado, who is Vice President of the Brazilian Institute of Architects. And also in São Paulo is Fernando Franco, who is professor at the FAU Mackenzie University in São Paulo and was formerly the Secretary of Urban Development of the Municipality of São Paulo between 2013 and 2016, which, as you'll hear, is a crucial period in our parking reform story. Hanna and Fernando were also two of the co-authors of a book chapter on parking in São Paulo in the book Parking: An International Perspective, edited by Dorina Pojani and several other people. So just to begin, I'm not sure which of you wants to jump in and just give our listeners a very brief picture of what the Sao Paulo region is like and the city of Sao Paulo's place in that region, and also a description of the big picture transportation situation of Sao Paulo. So who wants to jump in and give that big picture? Maybe Hannah?
Okay, let's try. Thanks, Paul, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. São Paulo, as you've mentioned, is a huge city. The São Paulo metropolitan region has 22 million inhabitants. And we have data from the Origin Destiny survey that is made every 5 years by our metro company here. We know that 1/3 of all trips are made in public transportation, so transit. 1/3 of all trips are made by foot, and 1/3 on private vehicles, so cars or motorcycles. You can understand the inequality that we have in the city by looking how people move around here. The rich people use more private vehicles, and the poor people travel more by foot and take the transit. Also, the time of the trip is much longer for those who live on the outskirts of the city and have a lower income. And because of that, the parking policy also plays a key role in tackling the inequality in the metropolitan region of São Paulo.
And there seems to me to be quite a rich set of civil society actors in Brazil, including in Sao Paulo. And maybe Clarissa, could you say a little bit about the role that civil society is playing in pushing for change? We have a city that is rather unequal and with a huge amount of traffic. It's famous for traffic problems, but it's clearly not actually a car city. It's only 1/3 of trips. So what kind of changes are civil society pushing for, and how are they going about that? And then perhaps we'll move to parking.
Thank you, Paul, for the invitation. It's really great to be here. We consider parking a very strategic topic in the discussion about urban mobility. I think we are adhering to the global agenda that is looking at climate change. We are also looking at air pollution at the cities. We are also looking at collisions. We are looking at the dispute of space. And when we look at the need to either avoid trips or shift trips from private cars, or in the case of Brazil, in fact, I wouldn't say shift, but maintain the population, the majority using public transport or active transport modes, we need to think how we have been allocating space in the street primarily for cars. We have allocated space primarily for private cars instead of public transport, by which we could have much more people being carried. And so we still have only 1/3 of the daily trips being made by private vehicles in São Paulo. But the reality is that we have seen in the last 2 decades a sharp increase in the motorization rates all over Brazil. We have seen the public transport lose demand, lose ridership radically. With the pandemic, that's again a trend. And it has been very difficult to bring people to public transport and to bring people to active transportation modes because that's not where the investments are. I think there is a big battle here, and there is a vision, and most cities in theory adhere to this vision that yes, population should be traveling by sustainable transport modes, but that's not where the investment is. And civil society organizations have been working towards pushing this agenda. How can we control polluting vehicles, and how can we secure that we have proper investment in public transport and in active transport modes?
And the strategic plan in 2014 of the city of Sao Paulo seems to reflect some success in persuading the city government to change in that direction. And we'll get to that in a little while, because parking was a big part of that. But before we do that, could we give the listeners a little bit of a picture of what parking is like in the city of Sao Paulo? You wrote this chapter, and it gives some really rich insights, I think. So, for example, in that chapter, you mentioned that a very large proportion of built space that has actually been provided in various different eras, different periods, has been parking. Could you perhaps just mention that? And then I've got a couple more questions about the picture of parking in Sao Paulo.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Paul, for the invitation. We have something strange here. That is the way we consider the FAR. FAR is divided by two categories. One is computable, where we have to follow a maximum FAR in every single part of the city. And we have a second one, which is not computable. And parking, private parking, belongs to the second category. Parking lot, private parking lot, is not computable in the FAR. So through history, São Paulo more or less is divided by 50% of the FAR is computable and 50% is not computable. So when we talk about on average 2.5 times the plot area, we actually were talking about 5, maybe a little bit more. So that's incredible that from the last decades to now, São Paulo might have produced more space, not computable, underground space for parking lots than space for people's activities. And that's absolutely bizarre.
We've got the private off-street. There's a lot of it because of the regulations, the former regulations at least. And then there's quite a lot of on-street parking, and at least in the core area, a lot of that is managed with either time limits or pricing or both. And then there's one other category that I was interested in, and I've seen this in many Latin American cities, which is that the off-street commercial parking, so paid parking in buildings. From your chapter, it seems that's a very, very significant part of the parking story. 500,000 spaces across the city where people park off-street, but they pay for their parking. How much of that is in a building that is, say, a shopping mall or a hotel or an office building, and how much of that is a dedicated parking building or a vacant lot with parking?
I would say the off-street parking in vacant lots or vacant plots of the city is the worst use of the urban land that you can have in the world. And so basically there are some areas, some plots in the cities that are not, that the real estate just wait for it to increase in value. And then, and meanwhile, there's a parking lot, a paid parking space. But you can find off-street parking that is part of another building, such as you mentioned, a mall. There's also some high-rise buildings that have commercial use that also have this paid parking inside. So usually it's underground. And something that's not very common is to have a building dedicated to garage, to parking space.
Okay.
I think it reflects actually the big supply of parking that we already have on the streets or off street. So there isn't a need to build a building dedicated to it.
That's interesting, yes. And the fact that there's not very many dedicated parking garages is partly reflecting low prices, I guess. It's hard to make a profit from a building dedicated to parking, but if you have parking as part of your building, charging for it is rational. And if you have vacant land that you're waiting for it to increase in value, it's rational to use it for parking. But people can't really make money if they have to count the value of the land with parking. It's not really a sensible business. But despite that, we have this oversupply of parking. So I think we have a basic picture. For those who really want to get their teeth into numbers and the details, they'll have to go and get your chapter. I'll include a little bit in the article that will go with this edition. But maybe let's move forward and talk about those reforms, because Sao Paulo's reforms in 2014 were very impressive. At that point, there had not many large cities around the world had abolished their parking minimums, their parking mandates. And Sao Paulo did that across the whole city in 2014 as part of a bigger strategic plan. So where did the impetus for that reform come from?
I'm also curious to learn that. Please tell us.
Well, Of course, institutions such as ITDP, universities, and so on, they had a very crucial role in this process because they have been producing knowledge, and this knowledge access public managers and also politicians somehow. I could say that we had at that time what we could say a progressive public term. But the question is not only to have good ideas, is politics is the main issue. And what happened in 2013, we had a social movement called Movimento Passe Livre, Free Pass Movement. And that movement, led by really young people, what they were claiming the reversion of the public transportation increased tax, 20 cents. And they start a spontaneous movement that reached a society in a very bad mood, a society that was not feeling comfortable with the way politics were carried out. I think Brazilian situation was very similar to United States, to Europe, to so many other parts of the world. This movement get a huge social and political movement captured by the right wing, the extreme right wing. But what happened is that through this movement, the mayor had the pretext, had the excuse to, well, if mobility is one of the main demands, one of the main issues, let's give them what they are asking about. So we could say that it was dramatic, but also an opportunity. Nobody likes to have the population screaming against you, but the mayor took this as a chance, as an opportunity to bring the mobility agenda to the X of the table, to the center of the table. And the agenda was this progressive agenda you're talking about.
That's fascinating. So a skillful leader was a key factor, but agitation from civil society, even if it was a little bit populist and pointing in a certain direction of unhappiness about this whole issue. And so that's really fascinating in the context. We mentioned the 2014 reforms, and one element of that with respect to parking was abolishing the parking mandates citywide for all land uses. But there was another element which perhaps was more controversial, strangely, was discouraging excessive parking supply along corridors. And internationally, there's a bit of confusion because people use the word maximums, which is not exactly what you did. There was a maximum, but it was a maximum of something, but it wasn't a maximum of parking. So could you explain that second reform that complemented the other reform and the controversy around it?
At that point, we had a paradigm shift because the municipality thought that private transportation was the most important one. So the regulations, the zoning law, and so on, obliged every single new building to offer parking plots. And we changed, we shift this paradigm. So we don't, as a policy, as a public policy, we don't want cars to be the element who drives the urban development. So we said there is no more minimum offer of parking plots. If you don't want to offer, you are not obliged to build parking lot anymore. And besides that, we established a limit, a very low limit for parking lots. Especially on the areas close to public transport lines, subways, metros, and bus lanes. So you can't offer more than one parking plot per housing unit.
Is that actually a limit?
So there's a limit, so this parking space is not considered a computable FAR. Beyond this limit, you don't have this FAR stimulus anymore, because you'd have to pay to build this parking lot.
Yeah, so in other words, if you want more parking beyond the limit, you have to have fewer bedrooms, fewer spaces for people, and less real estate that you can actually rent out or sell.
But if you want to offer more parking plots, you have to pay onerous grant.
There's also a fee associated with extra.
Yes, in São Paulo we do have this mechanism that if you want to build beyond a ratio of 1, you can pay the thing that I don't know in English.
Okay, yes, like a development fee or a penalty fee. Okay.
Yeah, it's onerous grant, as we call
it. That principle, I think, is actually a very exciting innovation, and other cities could really be inspired by that, because there's a lot of debate about maximums. Maximums are a little bit inflexible, where you just have an absolutely hard limit on how much parking can be provided. And even within parking reformers, some people say, no, that's too harsh or too rigid. But this idea where actually developers still have some choice. If they really, really want extra parking, they can, but there's a cost. And that's fair enough. Yeah, Clarisse.
Can I add something here? I think there is something that also gives a little bit of a perspective for us here. Is before the 2014 or 2013 street protests that Fernando is mentioning, São Paulo has already been a city in Brazil that has been concerned about the volume of vehicles. So it is the first city to have the rotating plates, for example, right?
Yeah, so that means rationing driving based on the license plate number each day, yes.
Exactly. So I was here trying to find a date when that was established. It was a few decades ago. We know already it's not a successful measure, but there was already a travel demand management measure being applied. It is one of the few cities, or maybe one of the first ones, to show the population the air quality, for example, at the specific days. So there has been a concern in São Paulo about the volume of vehicles circulating, and this concern is both related to air quality and related to congestion. So I would say that there was a little bit of a sort of a goodwill in terms of thinking, okay, what are the measures? I mean, it's a city that recognizes that the volume of vehicles, of private vehicles, is not working well. And this is not the same in other cities. So what we have seen in the last 2 decades, when we had this sharp increase in the motorization rates, is that most cities have never really cared about the volume of vehicles. And then all of a sudden they have a very large amount of vehicles circulating. While São Paulo, 2 decades ago, was already testing some measures.
Okay.
And that were not exactly successful. So the parking, and the reason why at the very beginning I said we find the parking reform something very strategic, is that it's something that has a really long-term impact in terms of people's behavior, right? So if they are going to decide to buy a car or not. But it's something that politically is very difficult to sell. I mean, who has the political capital to really push for a parking reform? No mayor has that. But maybe in a city that already recognizes the problem of the car. This put São Paulo in a moment, in a place in 2013, then together with the demand for public transport and all of that, put São Paulo in a moment that says, okay, we have a car problem, we have a public transport problem, and we need to find other ways to address. But it's important for us to recognize this moment where the city is in terms of understanding, recognizing that they have a car problem. Not every city has this so well recognized yet.
There was one point I want to pick up on, which was the idea that it's difficult to sell parking reform. And I mean, there are some parking reforms that they're kind of wonkish and detailed, and people don't pay attention. And in some ways they can pass because nobody really notices them. But some of the high-profile ones are very difficult to sell. And One thing that I noticed in Sao Paulo is it seems that you did successfully sell these reforms, although there was controversy, and perhaps you could tell us more about that. But you did sell these reforms because they were part of this big package, which included many other things that people could see as attractive and visionary. And parking was just part of that and complementary. Could you say a little bit more about the whole package and why parking was just part of this visionary strategic plan? Either Hannah or Fernando, go ahead.
Okay, I'll talk about a little bit about all the transportation enhancements that happened around that time. In 2013, a very interesting movement happened. For example, in the cycling infrastructure realm. So first, cycling was understood as leisure or as something that was in charge of the Department of Environment. And in 2013, the Department of Transportation really took the responsibility to implement cycling lanes. And this is also part of this great shift and this movement that happened in 2013, because between 2013 and 2016, the city of São Paulo implemented 400 kilometers of cycling lanes. So we had less than 60 kilometers, and we ended this term with almost 500 kilometers of cycling lanes. And at the same time, the city of São Paulo also implemented bus-only lanes. So if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the term, we had 500 kilometers of bus-only lanes in the city. So these were high impact and low cost measures that the city took that were happening in parallel to all this discussion in the master plan and the land use and the building code that Fernando was leading. So I think we had an amazing, and I like how Clarisse is optimistic here. We had an amazing window of opportunity and a shared vision to improve the transportation policy in the city. However, I know that no one really bothered about the exclusion of the mandates for parking. Like it was excluded. We removed the minimum requirements for parking, and no one said anything about it.
Oh, very interesting. That's very encouraging for other people in other cities then.
Fernando, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I felt. Because until now, we have the developers and the real estate fighting with the parameter that establishes the maximum. That maximum that is not the maximum, but let's call it the maximum to simplify. So there is still a huge debate, and the developers have been finding ways to build more parking spaces. So as Fernando mentioned, there was this great idea of establishing the maximum of one parking space per unit of housing, for one housing unit.
Non-countable FAR limit of one parking space. Go ahead.
Exactly, thanks. However, the developers are splitting these new units, so they are able to build more than one parking space, and then they combine the units and they sell it as a whole. I live in one of these areas. I live nearby a bus corridor, and I see developers announcing new apartment, 2 to 3 parking spaces. And I say, this is against the law. How are they doing it? And they found this way of splitting the units and then merging them again. Okay. So the culture for the rich people in the city, for the elite, hasn't changed. Like, it has improved, it's slowly changing, but we haven't reached there yet.
But then can I just ask something? At the same time, we have seen advertising and, I don't know, communications about new developments that are, in fact, selling the fact that they don't have a parking space, right? So new types of developments, nearby transit. So do you also see this movement? Because, I mean, me being my optimistic place, I see this and I think, wow, this is amazing. The real estate finds value in it. And I know they bypass as well, depending on the type of product that they are selling. So I know they think that a specific type of product they are not going to sell manage to sell without parking space. But I have also seen this like enthusiasm about having buildings without parking space. So I would really love to hear from the two of you if I'm being too optimistic, too Pollyanna here, or is it true?
No, both things are happening, and I know Fernando has a great case about it.
Both true. What we have to understand in a huge city like São Paulo is that when we talk about developer, there are so many. The market is huge. So the ones focused on selling big flats for high class that want to have four parking spaces in the property, they were not happy with us. But the ones selling extremely small, tiny housing units for hipsters, for very rich people who want to have a modern way of life in very well located places in the city, they were so happy they were not obliged to spend money in something that's extremely expensive, such as underground parking lots. But there is also a third market among so many others, the social housing market. And before the master plan, before the new rule, the municipality said that even for social housing, developers should offer parking places. So as the underground parking lots are so expensive, you can do that for social housing. So where do you offer parking space? On the ground. So they use it to consume a vast amount of land for offering parking space. So when the master plan said you don't have to offer anymore, they could intensify the land use and minimize the impact of the land cost in the production. So they were extremely happy with the new master plan.
Aha. And I guess we should give some context. In Sao Paulo region, the very poor tend to be beyond the boundaries of the city of Sao Paulo. Is that right? And then within Sao Paulo, you do have a diversity of socioeconomic groups, but generally speaking, it's more affluent than the further periphery. Is that too simplistic?
No, there are really poor areas within the boundaries of the city of São Paulo. There is for instance, Cidade Tiradentes. A lot of housing units were built there some decades ago, but it's disconnected from the city. There wasn't a transit line connecting this neighborhood with the rest of the city. I just wanted to add to what Fernando just said, and about a case that he told me about, that besides making a better use of the land, these developers that are focused on low-income people were also able to buy plots closer to the city center. So wonderful. These people are also were also able to afford housing closer to the opportunities, and this is due the fact that we have removed the minimum parking requirements. So this is a huge achievement.
That's what we like to hear. That's wonderful.
Maybe the impact of it is quite small if you compare it with the great impacts that happen in all other areas. The only thing here is that if we, going back to the first thing I said when I talked about the inequalities and the fact that the rich people have more cars and have more access because they can make more trips, so on and so forth, it's really important to advance even more in establishing a maximum non-computable FAR. So we really contain the use of cars by these rich people that are already living in the corridors and in areas that are full with transportation infrastructure.
And that reminds me perhaps to mention Curitiba. is very famous for its transit-oriented development along the BRT corridors, the bus rapid transit corridors. But one thing that I gleaned from a report from ITDP Brazil was that Curitiba, just like Sao Paulo, had high residential parking minimums mandates, and so most of the new housing along those BRT corridors was high-income housing, condominiums with too much parking, and so some of the benefit of that BRT and TOD was diminished or undermined by the parking. Is that an accurate critique?
Yes, absolutely. And I think an important point about Curitiba is that what we have seen is, in fact, when we look at the percentage of people living near transit, so it's not as high as it should be. And it is one of the most unequal ones in Brazil when we look at income levels. So who lives nearby the transit tends to be people of higher income, right? And I think this is a very important discussion, in particular when we're talking about São Paulo, for example, or other cities and large cities in Latin America, where we have a huge housing problem, deficit of housing, right? And then new developments like social housing developments tend to be in the extreme outskirts of the city. So all the measures that we make sure that we have more housing developed, right? More units delivered. So as Hannah and Fernando was mentioning here, and also closer to opportunity is crucial.
So Sao Paulo's reforms on the planning side, the off-street parking side, it's still a little early, but the signs are that there are some of the benefits we were hoping for are happening. And there's also some strange things of developers kind of trying to play the system. But have other cities across Brazil been inspired by Sao Paulo to try similar reforms of abolishing or reducing mandates and perhaps adopting something similar to this discouragement using the FAR limit?
I think Belo Horizonte, right?
We have the case of Belo Horizonte in the master plan and Rio de Janeiro in the building code. They defined a new building code for all new developments along the transit station. That includes the BRT, the subway, and the train. And they have also parking maximums now. But I think Belo Horizonte was very inspired by São Paulo's master plan of 2014. And it was, I think, finalized maybe about 2 years ago, I think just before the pandemic, right? Uh-huh. So I think this discussion it is around, but just a few cities we have seen really actual land use instruments being revised with new parameters.
Okay.
So I would say Belo Horizonte and Rio with the building code. So Rio is not citywide, it's just for a radius of 800 meters around stations, if I'm not mistaken.
So maybe that's enough for the off-street parking story, unless there's some key element that we've missed and you're bursting to share it. I would like to talk a little bit about on-street parking. Fernando, you wanted to say more about off-street parking?
I like to think, which is a conceptual thing. We have in our constitution one concept, which is about the social function of property. Although the Constitution allows anyone to have a property, the property has to accomplish a social function. What São Paulo did, São Paulo decided to say that empty, spoiled, vacant plots, especially in very well-located areas, who are used as parking lots, this use is not suitable with the concept of the social function of property. So those plots are submitted to a specific urbanistic tool, just to simplify, a kind of progressive land tax. If you keep using this as a parking lot, your land tax will increase every single year up to 5 years. And if you don't do anything to give back the land to the market, then the municipality can buy your land through public debt titles, which is not a good deal for the owner. So I think this concept is crucial. Parking lot in vacant lots are not considered social function of property.
And that ruling and that tax policy, could you perhaps give the name in Portuguese so that listeners can search for it more easily?
It's difficult. Parcelamento, edificação, utilização compulsória. PEUC.
Portuguese speakers out there, that they'll be able to Google that and be inspired. Thanks. That's fascinating, and I wasn't aware of that. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to just at least mention the on-street parking reforms and this on-street parking scene. The on-street parking has been priced for many decades, but there's never been parking meters in the streets in São Paulo. Is that correct?
Yes.
We have a system, a paper system in the beginning, and now is digital.
Okay, the paper coupons and then the replacement with the digital blue zones where it's, if I understand correctly, the only way to pay for parking in the streets is with a mobile app with the digital blue zones.
Yes.
Other countries, other cities have been very cautious about moving to that because they say, oh, well, it's unfair. Many people don't have a phone, or your phone might have run out of battery. How do you address that in São Paulo?
Well, I think you can also go to a newspaper stand and get it and buy it, if I'm not mistaken. But if you have a car, you probably do have a phone, right? You probably do have a smartphone. I love how the on-street parking policy, it's very old in the city of São Paulo. It dates from 1975, if I'm not mistaken. And it has inspired other Brazilian cities to adopt this same measure using the paper coupons, right?
Also, São Paulo was the pioneer of that. That's interesting.
São Paulo was the pioneer in Brazil, yes.
Okay. Singapore has the same system, and I understand Israel used to have the same system, and I wonder who was the pioneer, who learnt from whom, I don't know. Certainly Singapore was after São Paulo.
In 2015, there was this shift from the paper coupons to digital apps, and the city basically allowed any developer or any application developer to provide this system, and with that, it immediately raised the stated income with the payment for parking, because there were lots of fake paper coupons being used. So from one day to the other, the city doubled its income. And a couple of years later, the city decided to issue a concession to one private company to manage the whole parking, on-street parking system. And there are good aspects about it and bad aspects about it.
This topic is crucial because this concession made the municipality lose control on the public space policy. Now the company who owns the concession is the one who decides how and what to do with the public space.
Oh dear.
Yes.
And this is a disaster for all the other policies concerning how to use the scarcity of the public space.
Okay. It sounds like there's a whole story opened up that we need to investigate. Just broadly speaking, notwithstanding that new problem which is emerging of the concession, but broadly speaking, do people say that on-street parking in the busy parts of São Paulo is generally well managed, or well managed enough that there's not chaos? It's reasonably effective, the on-street parking management these days, since 2016 or so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because it's a good business.
After the concession was issued, the enforcement increased a lot.
Okay.
So this is the good aspect of the concession. The bad aspect is exactly what Fernando said, that it has frozen our curbside area.
So the possibility of new bicycle lanes, for example,
Exactly.
and new bus lanes, etc., has been frozen.
Now there is another actor in the field, in the discussion of what to do with this extra space that is so valuable. And
yeah. How long is this concession? What are the dates?
20 years.
20 years, aha, which is longer than ITDP, for example, would recommend for a parking concession.
Oh, yeah, of course. I don't even know what would be the recommendation, but probably just a couple of years and constant renewals, right? And constant like revision of contract. I mean, can you imagine having, we don't recommend it for public transport anymore. Why would we recommend it for parking?
We had an episode about the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there's open entry on these parking apps. Multiple companies can join in any city in the Netherlands.
But that's exactly what we had from 2016 until the concession happened, which was, I think, in 2020. So we had a great model.
I assume there must be some story of why a successful model was replaced by this worrying model.
No, the city needed money and they...
Oh, that's the neoliberal policy. A progressive policy has been replaced by a neoliberal policy.
But also because the city wanted to have more income, and they found it easily they basically adiantaram os recebíveis. So they basically advanced all that they could earn through charging for parking.
They got a lump sum sooner than they would have otherwise. Yes, and that was tempting. So it sounds very similar to what has happened in Chicago in some ways, yes. Okay, let's end, but just thank you so much, all of you. Maybe could each of you for 30 seconds just say something very brief about why should someone in Delhi or Nairobi or New York City or a small city somewhere in Malaysia or Indonesia care about what is going on in São Paulo and the reforms to parking in São Paulo? So maybe take it in turns. Maybe Clarisse?
Well, what I think is that all the cities, all the large cities or cities like São Paulo or everywhere, regardless of the continent, are facing the need to change paradigm, the need to deal with climate change, the need to deal with the dispute for space in the cities and to offer a better quality of life in the street, in the cities for all its citizens. This is, I mean, part of the Paris commitment. This is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is part of the new urban agenda. I mean, we are all facing the same challenges, and it is urgent that we revise the amount of space and privilege that we give to private vehicles in our cities. So I think we all have a lot to learn between ourselves. We don't need to be reinventing the wheels every time. And I think large cities like São Paulo there are lots of there's a lot of memory in terms of what has been tried, what is the relationship with civil society, with the private sector, with the government. And there are no doubts that we can also teach others, or we can share our lessons and our failures. And I think together we can find solutions for our cities.
Fernando?
Well, if you want to do a parking reform, we're not talking about revolution. In this sense, a reform is about understanding how the political process is incremental. So look backwards to see what concrete steps your city has already done, and set the following ones that will lead the city to a better use of the public space, which is one of the most important resources we can find in cities.
Hannah?
In my opinion, parking policies are not very well debated because it's so complicated. Here we even found it hard to find the correct words in another language to refer to these imbricated parameters and laws. But it's crucial to advance and improve the parking policies in a city if we want to have a healthier, more sustainable and better cities for our future.
Well, thank you all for being on the Reinventing Parking podcast. It's been great. And it's a fascinating place, Sao Paulo. I haven't visited, and I really very much look forward to one day. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Paul, for organizing it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this podcast, and I've looked into your website and has a lot of content.
You're making me very happy. Thank you.
Super helpful for policymakers. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.